So your company is thinking about an acquisition, and as part of their due diligence, they've come to you to do some digging and try and understand what might be the additional risks that they might incur if they were to go through with it. And of course, you want to do a good job, and so you want to be thorough, but at the same time, acquisitions are often a sensitive topic, and so you want to follow the principle of need to know. You want to minimize the number of people that are involved. You want to make sure that any discovery that you do does not raise a whole bunch of alerts in the target network. And oftentimes, you need to complete these assessments rather quickly. So what do? Well, runZero is an asset inventory and network discovery platform that finds all of your managed and unmanaged assets in a variety of environments: IT, OT, cloud, and even work from home. And in this video, I'm going to show you how other customers have used runZero for this exact purpose, how they were able to quickly gather an astonishing amount of detail without making waves, so to speak. So why don't you come take a look and decide if runZero is the tool for you. Let's get into it.
Before we get into any discussion about discovery or scanning, it's important for us to talk about some important considerations. First and foremost, in this video, I keep talking about mergers and acquisitions, and that's for a good reason. Typically, security is brought in for due diligence towards the end of the acquisition discussion, and so legal probably has already discussed some terms. It's fair to assume that you probably have the permission, the legal permission, to conduct this type of discovery activity. Technically speaking, you could do this for any situation that interests you. Perhaps you want to vet a third-party vendor to understand what might be the third-party risk that you're exposed to if you were to start working with them. But of course, in those cases, the legal discussions tend to be a little bit more variable. My point here is you should always make sure that the expectations of your stakeholders are aligned to what you're about to do. The second important consideration is where you will put this data in your runZero account. Within runZero, the organization is considered a distinct entity. This could be a business, a division, a department, or a customer. So it makes sense that a target company's asset inventory goes into a separate organization. After all, it is a distinct entity. However, I encourage you to consider a project instead. Projects are tailor-made for short-term discovery efforts. The data becomes read-only after 30 days and is automatically deleted after 90. So unless you need to start modifying asset inventory for this target company, or your due diligence is going to take more than 3 months, there's no reason for you to not use a project instead of an organization. And the benefit to you is you get 5x the asset count. So if your target company happens to have a lot of assets, you will be able to handle that with a project, but perhaps not with an organization. If you're in the unfortunate situation where the target company has so many assets that you end up going beyond 5x your asset count limit, well then please contact your account executive for assistance. All right. So the third consideration here goes back to the principle of need to know that we discussed earlier. If you were to put this target company's asset inventory within your runZero account, any super user will be able to see that asset inventory. If this is not acceptable, then you will need a separate account. Also, if for whatever reason your legal department requires that you conduct this type of discovery activity from a completely separate account, you will also need, of course, a separate account. In those situations, please contact your account executive for assistance. Shifting gears now, let's talk about how we can do discovery against the externally facing assets of a target company. This is similar to the view that an adversary would have for the target company, so it's highly relevant to you in your quest to understand what might be the additional risks that you might incur if you were to go through with the acquisition. The good news is this is really easy to do with runZero. You don't even have to deploy your own Explorer. For those of you who are new to runZero, Explorer is the name of our scan engine. So you don't even need to deploy one on your own. Rather, you can just reuse one of the Explorers that is hosted and managed by runZero. And all you have to do is type in the domain name of your target company. And when you click on initialize, it will bring up a list of sample targets. And then if you click confirm, it starts the scan. Now, the reason why this works and the reason why this is so easy with runZero is because runZero has an unauthenticated scanner, meaning we don't need credentials. You're not on this configuration page filling out usernames and passwords for a variety of hosts. It's not necessary. All you have to provide is the domain name. Now, of course, you might be thinking, oh, this is an unauthenticated scanner, so therefore it's not going to get a whole lot of detail because it's not on the box. Well, stay tuned. Later in this video, you're going to see how much detail we can get. People are often very surprised how much detail you can get with an unauthenticated scanner when it is coupled with high fidelity fingerprinting. Okay, so now if you want to bring internal assets into your due diligence process, you will need assistance from somebody from the target company. What you need your counterpart to do is simply to install one or more Explorers on your behalf. And because the Explorer is compatible with a variety of platforms and architectures, your counterpart is not having to jump through hoops to find a machine that can be a host. You would simply download the installation file and send it off to this person, and your counterpart will then run the installation, which generally speaking takes less than 60 seconds. As an alternative, some customers have elected to not send an installation file. Instead, they will install the Explorer on a Raspberry Pi and then send the Raspberry Pi over instead. So at that point, your counterpart just needs to plug in a cable. All right. Once the Explorer has been installed or the Raspberry Pi has been plugged in, the Explorer will show up under Registered Explorers. I'm going to switch organizations here for illustrative purposes. So the Explorer will show up over here. And what you would do is you would head over to your inventory and you can configure a new scan. You would select the Explorer that your counterpart installed for you. And then you would put in a discovery scope, CIDR blocks that have been provided by your counterpart for scanning. And then you click initialize scan and then hit confirm, and then away you go. Before moving on to the last part of this video, I do want to make one final comment about internal versus external scanning as it relates to one of the important considerations that we discussed earlier. If it is part of your due diligence to evaluate the externally facing assets and the internal assets separately, then of course you would create two different projects for this. If, however, you want to bring all those assets into a single project, you can do that as well. And runZero does a very good job of deduplicating assets that came from different sources. And so you may get a more accurate overall asset count if you were to use a single project. Okay, so now that you've scanned all these assets and you have all this data, you will want to conduct a risk assessment. runZero is not a risk assessment tool, but there are a number of features and functions that can help you get an initial high-level understanding of these assets. What are the variety of assets that I have on my hands? And information that can otherwise help you scope or parameterize your risk assessment, whatever that risk assessment methodology might be. Of course, in real life, oftentimes as part of this due diligence, we don't get the time to do a full risk assessment. And so you may end up using runZero for this purpose. However, we don't recommend that you do that. We always recommend that you conduct a full risk assessment whenever possible. Okay, so in the next part of the video, I'm going to show you some of the things that I would look at if I were acquiring a company. This is not meant to be an exhaustive step-by-step risk check everything, but really just some of what are the things that I would look at if I were buying a company, what are the things I would look at first, and so on and so forth. So to do that, I'm going to jump back over to this other project that I had. A word about the assets that you have here. These assets come from a real life company. The host names and the IP addresses have been modified so that they're obfuscated. And this is from an external scan only. I did not conduct an internal scan for this particular video. Okay, so one of the first things I like doing is getting an understanding of the company's tech stack. What are the technologies that they have chosen to run with? I like to start by going to the dashboard and taking a look at the operating system widget, and I can see here that this company uses a mix of Linux as well as Windows. Okay, good to know. And also checking out their ports. Right off the bat here, I see there's a lot of web traffic, HTTP, both encrypted as well as unencrypted. And I also see a lot of ports that you often use when you want to do HTTP, but for some reason you can't or don't want to run on a privileged port. So I got 8443, we got 8080, 8880, 9443. I also see email SMTP over here. I see DNS. I also see SSH. So some of these machines are reachable via SSH over the internet. Okay. And what I just saw there really tracks in terms of protocols. We saw TLS, HTTP, SSH, DNS, and so on, SMTP, and so on and so forth. There's also OpenVPN. Also good to know. All right. One other important widget for understanding the tech stack is looking at the products. Okay, so I could see here, okay, Cloudflare, load balancer, lots of AWS resources. I see web servers. I can see three different types of web servers. I got Nginx, I got IIS, as well as Apache. I got some load balancers, F5, Amazon. Okay, we're running Kubernetes, it appears. We got SAP, NetWeaver. Okay. More AWS resources, Apache Tomcat, so some Java technology running there. PHP, Drupal, so PHP technologies running there. Akamai, so we got Atlassian, two different types of Atlassian products there as well, and more application gateways, and then also documentation for developers. Okay, so again, just giving you a good understanding of what this company has, in this case, just for their externally facing assets. But of course, if I scan internal assets, there'd be a broader view as well. All right, so this is giving me a good sort of understanding of what that tech stack looks like, right? But these are dashboard widgets. There's also a way for you to take a look at this information in a more curated fashion that's a little bit more suitable for stakeholders. So we're going to go to reports. I'm going to show you the external assets report. In this report, I could actually include every single asset, all 330 of them, but I'm not going to, as well as screenshots and so on and so forth. So for the purposes of this video, I'll just go ahead and just generate that external asset report for you. And there it is. And here you can see that this information is similar to what you saw before, but it's a little bit more curated. There's an executive summary, so it's more suitable for stakeholders and things of that nature. So you can see a list of top ASNs, asset types, operating systems, similar to what we saw earlier, protocols, products, certificate authorities, and a really good overview of where these assets are in the world, right? Something that could potentially have great ramifications for an acquisition, right? These are where all the assets are in the world. Expired certificates and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's one other report that's worth noting, especially if we brought in internal assets as well, and I'll explain why in a moment. And this is the organization overview report. And again, I could include assets, I could include screenshots. I'm not going to, just so we can generate this report quickly. And there it is. Again, curated version of a lot of what you saw in the dashboard, suitable for stakeholders and the like. Again, more information about about the various assets. One thing that you'll find here that's not in the external asset report is the RFC 1918 coverage report, subnet utilization, as well as switch overview, where we're bringing in information about the network itself, not just the assets. Okay, so that is a look at the tech stack of this company. And so now I'm going to jump over to examining things that might be risky, things that might be of interest from a risk perspective. One thing that piqued my interest earlier was the Drupal CMS that I saw in the product widget. When I click on this, I will go to the services inventory with the search filter already in place, and I can click on asset details. And here I'm going to search for last.html to bring up an attribute that will tell me the version number of Drupal here. Now, checking on Wikipedia, I see that the current stable release version of Drupal is 9.4.1. So the fact that this is version 7 is of some interest to me for this due diligence. Going back to the dashboard again, and once again to the product widget, I also like to dig in a little bit deeper into PHP. And here, once again, I can go into the asset details, and I will once again search for last.html, and I see that I'm running WordPress 6.0.1. And having a look at Wikipedia, I see that the current stable release is 6.0.2, and it was released just 12 days ago. So this is probably of less of a concern. You've seen me so far in runZero pivot from visualization to asset inventory search to asset details. There are many ways to pivot throughout runZero. One of these ways is with this magnifying glass over here. If I were to click on this, I would do a search with last HTML generator as the key and WordPress 6.0.1 as the value. But there's also another magnifying glass here, the one with the plus sign inside of it. If I were to click on this one, I would do a group by on last HTML generator, and it would give me a frequency analysis. For our purposes here, that would be more relevant, and so I'm going to click on that. And very quickly I can see, aha, I only have one version of WordPress within this asset inventory. It's on 2 different assets, and then I have 2 different versions of Drupal, 7 and 9, spread out over 6 different assets. All very useful information to feed into my later risk assessment, either as a parameter or for scoping purposes. Returning to the dashboard, there's one other thing I saw in one of the widgets that I thought would be very interesting, which is SSH. Let's have a look here. You can see here multiple SSH instances. And I'm most interested to know if there are any SSH servers that are allowing passwords as opposed to requiring public key. There's an attribute here called auth methods, and I can see that on this instance it's public key only, no passwords allowed. But what about on all the other instances? Well, again, I can do that frequency analysis, and I can see that there's only one row here. So all the instances of SSH servers are only allowing public key. They're not allowing passwords or anything else. Before I go on to the next risk check, I do want to elaborate on something that I mentioned earlier, which is the fact that runZero is an unauthenticated scanner. Folks are often, more than often, almost always surprised at the level of details that we're able to gather, even though we don't log into the box, we don't have an agent on the box. Everything that we discover is over the network. And yet we can even do things like say, hey, these 2 different IP addresses are actually the same machine, and so therefore we do deduplicate that into a single record. But nevertheless, it is a huge surprise to many folks that we can discover all these details, both at the asset level as well as the level of all the different services. And part of this is because our unauthenticated scanner is coupled with a security research-based approach for fingerprinting, meaning that we are looking at things from the perspective of the adversary. We're using their perspective to figure out what are all the assets that are on the network and what are all the services on the network and what are all the different attributes of those assets and services. And we're going to gather all that information and bring that all back into the database for later use for a variety of use cases. Right now, we are looking to do a risk assessment, but there are many, many other use cases that where you can leverage this wealth of data that comes from this security research-based approach. Okay, back to looking through the assets for things that are potentially risky. One thing that I like to do is to see if there are any assets that have an internal purpose or should be restricted to internal that seem to be available externally. So one thing that I like searching for is Git, and I can see here, hey, there's a machine whose hostname is dev and has a secondary hostname QA. So very, very interesting stuff. These machines presumably have a function that's internal only, and yet they're available as an externally facing asset. So not saying there's anything wrong here, but is something that should feed into your risk assessment later. Along the same lines, you can also search for Jenkins. Is this a build server? Maybe, maybe not. Although if you mouse over, you can see QA is in the secondary host name there. So this probably is a build server. Again, fulfilling some sort of internal purpose. Why is it available from the internet? Okay, moving on. Rather than me doing manual queries, I also want to show you some of the predefined queries that we have in our query library that could be useful for this type of exercise. So I'll start by showing you a query that can tell you if you have RDP exposed on the internet. Let's have a look here. And we come up with 0 assets. So this is good. This company that we're looking to acquire has done right and made sure that there's no machine that's externally facing that's available, has a service available via RDP. I'm just going to check here. VNC, same thing. So that's looking really, really good. Happy to see that. Next, let's go back to our queries and let's have a look at expiring certificates. So we have one query that shows soon to expired certificates, and there's another one for the ones that are already expired. So let's check on the ones that are already expired. And we have 12 instances here where we have expiring certificates. So this is something of concern, and again would feed into our risk assessment later. All right, next query here. We're going to search to see if there are machines that are potential bridges from the outside to the inside, some publicly facing subnet to an internal subnet. Now, you might be wondering, what is the purpose of this? Because earlier I said I did a scan of of externally facing assets. So why would we have any knowledge of internal assets? Well, this goes back to what I was saying about the security research-based approach. This machine has a publicly facing address, right, 2.59, but through information that was leaked to the unauthenticated scanner, we were able to see that there's actually that this machine has an internal address as well, 172.34.116. So even though we were not scanning from the inside, we were able to discover what its IP address is on the inside. And again, this is information that should be fed into our risk assessment later. Okay, I'm going to move on from doing asset inventory searches and have a look at screenshots. Screenshots are a great way to help you get this initial look at a company and understand what their assets look like. Screenshots are available if the runZero Explorer is hosted on a machine that has a Chrome browser. When you do so, when you do your scan, you have the option to select to take screenshots, and they would show up here, and you can iterate through them and have a look. Earlier, I took a look, and so I know there's something interesting that's further down here, so I'm going to hop down there for you. So this was of interest. Okta provides identity access management services, and oftentimes this could be kept as something internal. So does it actually need to be externally available for login? Maybe yes, maybe no, but it's definitely something that's of interest for your risk assessment later. Here's something else that's worth looking into. So this is a login page for a Cisco VPN device. Does this need to be externally accessible? Maybe yes, maybe no. But whatever the case might be, it's something that's worth looking into when you do your later risk assessment. All right, let's have a look at something else. So here we can see that there's API documentation. If this is some off-the-shelf software or open source software and has an API documentation, then maybe that's okay because that's public information anyway. But if this were an internal application, maybe it's not a good idea to have that publicly accessible. Of course, I don't know right now whether or not what this actual API is, so I can't say, but definitely as part of that risk assessment, it might be something that's worth looking into. All right, here's something else that is of concern. So apparently we've found an API endpoint. You know, if the adversary were able to find this, would it be possible for them to fuzz the URL and then start gathering some information that they're not supposed to? Maybe yes, maybe no. But again, this is something that's going to scope your risk assessment later, where you want to dig into this a little bit further. All right, and then more instances of VPN devices. Let's go on to the next page here. There's a couple of more things here that I saw earlier that were worth looking into. So here is a web portal for some service, and it's offering a login, and apparently it's running over port 80, which is definitely something of concern, and you definitely want to look into that a little bit further when you do your risk assessment. All right, and here's the last screenshot that I want to share with you. This index page is not a login page, but instead it's a directory listing. And one of these directories on here is log files. And it's potentially a treasure trove of information for the adversary to gather for whatever purposes they might be engaged in. But whatever the case might be, this is definitely something that should not be publicly accessible. This should be locked down. And again, you should dig into this a little bit more when you do your risk assessment. All right. So as I mentioned before, I just want to go through a quick list, non-exhaustive list of things that I would check if I were just trying to get an initial high-level view of a target company to understand where I want to focus my risk assessment efforts. And these are the types of things that I would look at, and this is by no means exhaustive. Just some of the things I would definitely try amongst other types of things. At some point, of course, you're going to go beyond this sort of high-level look at a company, and you want to actually do a risk assessment, in which case, of course, you're going to need the data. And for that, you would simply just come over to your asset inventory, you hit export, and then you can export out to one of these formats and then feed into your risk assessment process.
So that's it. runZero's unauthenticated scanner, without any agents or credentials or spam ports or taps, is able to provide an asset inventory with a wealth of detail that allows you to perform a risk assessment on a company that you're thinking about acquiring. And without any sort of assistance from anybody from the other side, you can inventory all of their externally facing assets. And with a little bit of help from somebody from the target network, you can inventory all of their internal assets as well. But don't take my word for it. Go over to runZero.com and sign up for a free trial. You don't even need to provide your credit card, and you can just go ahead and try this out for yourself. All right, that's it from me. If you're interested in learning about other runZero features and functions, please check out the other videos in the runZero product walkthrough series.